Born some 500 years before the birth of Jesus, the Buddha would grow to manhood in a town vanished long ago. For nearly 3 decades, he would see nothing of the world beyond. The tales say he was the son of a king, raised in a palace with every imaginable luxury. He was called Siddhartha Gautama.
The father wants him to be a king, wants him to conquer the world, to be the emperor of India, which at that time was 16 different kingdoms, and it was predicted that he would be able to conquer wherever he wanted if he remained as a king. So the father was creating this artificial environment to coddle him.
His father wanted to prevent him from ever noticing that anything might be wrong with the world, because he hoped that he would stay in the life they knew and loved and not go off as was predicted at his birth and possibly become a spiritual teacher rather than a king.
Shielded from pain and suffering, Siddhartha indulged in a life of pure pleasure. Every whim satisfied, every desire fulfilled. I wore the most costly garments, ate the finest foods. I was surrounded by beautiful women. During the rainy season, I stayed in my palace, where I was entertained by musicians and dancing girls. I never even thought of leaving. When he was 16, his father, drawing him tighter into palace life, married him to his cousin. It wasn't long before they fell in love. And so, the stories say, he indulged himself for 29 years, until the shimmering bubble of pleasure burst.
His father does everything he can to never let him leave, never let him see the suffering that life is. But one day he goes outside and he's traveling through the kingdom, and the first of 4 encounters. He sees an old man and he asks his attendant, and the attendant says, "Oh, that's change. One doesn't always stay young and perfect." Then on the next tour outside, he sees a sick man and doesn't quite understand what it is. He asks his attendant, and the attendant says, "Oh, that happens to all of us."
Everybody gets sick, and don't think you are a prince, you will not get sick. Your father will get sick, your mom will get sick, everybody will be.
And on his 3rd trip outside, he meets a corpse, and he recognizes impermanence and suffering and death as the real state of things. The world that he had been protected from, shielded from, kept from seeing.
And he was shocked. He was shocked, and he realized, this is my fate too. I will also become old. I will also become ill. I will also die. How do I deal with these things? These are universal questions in any human being's life. What it's like to be in a body inside of time and our fate, and how do we navigate that? It really is a tale of the transformation from a certain naive, innocent relationship to your own life to wanting to know the full story, wanting to know the full truth.
And then the fourth trip outside, he sees a spiritual seeker, someone who has decided to live a life completely other than his life in order to escape from impermanence, suffering, and death. So he has this sort of traumatic encounter with the pain and suffering of life.
We try to protect our children. We don't want to let our children see all the pain that's in the world. But at a very early age, at a time before he could remember anything, at a time before there was conceptual thought, he already suffered the worst kind of loss that one could suffer. Suddenly and mysteriously, his mother died when he was a week old. So something tragic happened, right at the beginning. That might be what it takes to become a Buddha, is that you have to suffer on such a primitive level.
At 29 years old, profoundly troubled, Siddhartha was determined to comprehend the nature of suffering. He resolved to leave the palace. His wife had just given birth to a baby boy. Siddhartha called him Rahula.
Late one summer evening, Siddhartha went into his wife's room. His wife lay sleeping on a bed strewn with flowers, cradling their newborn son in her arms. He gazed from the threshold, deep in thought. If I take my wife's hand from my son's head and pick him up and hold him in my arms, it will be painful for me to leave. He turned away and climbed down to the palace courtyard.
Grief and probably absolute puzzlement and dismay he left in the hearts of wife, in the infant son who was innocent and yet was suddenly fatherless, and of course his own father. But there is no knowledge won without sacrifice. And this is one of the hard truths of human existence. In order to gain anything, you must first lose everything.
Siddhartha wandered south toward the holy Ganges River. Once a great prince, now he became a beggar. Siddhartha could not expect help from the religion of the time, the ancient Vedic religion, steeped in ceremony and ritual. For centuries, the Vedic rituals had commanded respect for the gods and inspired conviction. By Siddhartha's time, the rituals no longer spoke to the spiritual needs of many Indians, leaving a spiritual vacuum and a sense of foreboding.
The gods become less important than the rituals themselves. It's a period of great unrest. It's a period of social upheaval, social change.
Cities were growing, generating new wealth and spiritual hunger. Siddhartha joined thousands of searchers like himself. Renunciants, men and even a few women who had renounced the world, embracing poverty and celibacy, living on the edge, just as spiritual seekers still do in India today.
The notion of reincarnation is something that's part of Indian culture, part of Indian civilization, part of Indian religion that was there long before the Buddha.
Suffering didn't begin at birth and finish with death. Suffering was endless. Unless it was possible to find a way out, become enlightened, become a Buddha. With the authority of the priests worn thin and wisdom seekers like Siddhartha roaming the countryside, holy men emerged, teaching their own spiritual disciplines. Siddhartha apprenticed himself to one of them, a celebrated guru who taught that true knowledge could never come from ritual practice alone. It was necessary to look within. You may stay here with me, the guru told him. A wise person can soon dwell in his teacher's knowledge and experience it directly for himself.
The teachers of the time are already teaching forms of yoga and meditation, teaching that the self-reflective capacity of the mind can be put to use to tame the mind, to tame the passions. That was already established in India. And there were probably so many schools of yoga and meditation in those days, just as there are now.
Some yogis learned to sit without moving for hours, breathing more and more slowly until they seemed to be barely breathing at all.
All kinds of trance states are possible through meditation. If you hold the mind, if you concentrate the mind on a single object, be it a word or a candle flame or a sound, it's possible to transport the mind into all kinds of interesting places.
He ascends to these very rarefied states of consciousness, but it's not permanent. And it does not bring penetrating truth into the nature of reality. So these become a temporary escape from the problem of existence, but they don't solve the problem.
Siddhartha apprenticed himself to another popular guru, but the results were the same. The thought occurred to me, he said later. This practice does not lead to direct knowledge, to deeper awareness. Disenchanted, he left this master too. Siddhartha continued to drift south, still searching for the answer to his questions. Why do human beings suffer? Is there any escape? Among the renunciants, asceticism was a common spiritual practice, punishing the body as a way to attain serenity and wisdom. Siddhartha punished himself for 6 years.
You can be liberated if you eliminate everything that's human, everything that's coarse and vulgar, every bit of anger, every bit of desire. If you wipe that out with force of will, then you can go into some kind of transcendental state. And the Buddha tried all that, and he became, the most anorectic of the anorectic ascetics.
One great taproot of Buddhism is compassion, which is the deep affection that we feel for everything, because we're all in it together, be it other human beings, other animals, the planet as a whole, the creatures of this planet, the trees and rivers of this planet. Everything is connected.
Siddhartha punished his mind and body. That had almost killed him. Now, he knew what he must do. To find the answer to his questions, he would look within and trust himself. Bodh Gaya is a small town in northeastern India. Throngs of pilgrims have come here from all over the world for more than 16 centuries. For Buddhists, there are hundreds of holy places, but none more sacred than this one. Bodh Gaya is the sacred point from which the Buddhist faith radiates. Some pilgrims travel great distances, reciting prayers and prostrating themselves every step of the way. Their Holy of Holies is not the imposing temple beside them, but a simple fig tree, Ficus religiosa, the Bodhi tree. The tree, it is said, is descended from the Buddha's time. Every pilgrim knows the story of how Siddhartha, after accepting the rice milk from the young girl, put aside the rags he was wearing, bathed himself in a nearby river, and strengthened, sat down in the shade of the Bodhi tree and began to meditate.
He sat down under a Bodhi tree in the shelter of the natural world in all of its beauty and fullness. And he said, I will not move from this place until I have solved my problem.
He gains the power to see the process of birth, death, and rebirth that all creatures go through. He's given this sort of cosmic vision of the workings of the entire universe.
My mind, he said, is at peace. He had become the awakened one, the Buddha.
Something new opens up for him, which he calls nirvana, which he calls awakening.
He said, at this moment, all beings and I awaken together. Nirvana is this moment seen directly. There is nowhere else than here. The only gate is now. The only doorway is your own body and mind. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing else to be. There's no destination. It's not something to aim for in the afterlife. It's simply the quality of this moment.
For weeks, the Buddha remained near the Bodhi tree, peaceful and serene. He was tempted to retire into a profound solitude, instead of trying to teach others what it had taken him 6 long years to discover for himself.
He wants to stay there. He's very happy. He doesn't want to go out. He says to himself, no one is going to understand this. People are going to think I'm crazy.
Buddha saw the nature of the people, envy and jealousy and strong negative mental states. All the people in the world, they are like the fishes wriggling in the very shallow water. So Buddha, he himself, afraid to teach the people.
When somebody becomes enlightened, something blooms in his heart. It's like a flower blooms and it cannot hold the fragrance. It has to naturally release. So it's like he naturally had to release his radiance. He has to share this joy that was in his heart.
Buddha meets someone who doesn't see anything special about him, because the awakened Buddha doesn't look any different from anybody else. He is ordinary. Buddhism is not about being special. Buddhism is about being ordinary. And it is not about the continual exudation of bliss. It is about walking a normal human life with normal human beings, doing normal human things. And this reminds you that you yourself might be a Buddha at this moment. The person you're looking at might be one. It's an interesting practice. Just each person you see as you walk down the street, Buddha, 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 Buddha.
From Bodh Gaya, the Buddha walked west nearly 200 miles and crossed the Ganges River. He was still searching for a way to explain to others what he feared was unexplainable. The path to the enlightenment he himself had experienced. His first teaching would later be called Setting in Motion the Wheel of the Dharma, because it brought the Buddha's message into the world for the first time. He did not propound a dogma. Instead, he spoke from his own experience, out of his own heart. He had known the abandon of the sensualist and the rigors of the ascetic. Now, he would disavow both of them.
The Buddha said, I've discovered a new way, and it's not the path of asceticism, and it's not the path of sensory indulgence. It's the middle way. What the Buddha was always doing was saying everything needs to be balanced. So, the middle way was always balancing between, excesses on this side, excesses on the other side.
The path to enlightenment lay along the middle way, the Buddha taught, and the ascetics listened. Now he would answer the question that 6 years before had provoked his spiritual journey, the question of suffering. The Buddha's analysis of suffering came in the form of what have come to be called the Four Noble Truths.
Suffering is not entirely accurate to the word that the Buddha probably used. it means something closer to dissatisfaction. That, we're never quite happy, and if we are, that's gone in an instant anyhow.
While the second noble truth asserts that suffering has a cause, the third noble truth makes an astonishing claim. The problem, Buddha taught, is desire. How to live with the confused and entangling desires of our own minds.
People often misunderstand Buddhism as saying, in order to wipe out suffering, you have to wipe out desire. If that was what the Buddha was saying, then where does the desire for enlightenment fit in? The Buddha is saying, be smart about your desires.
With the fourth and final noble truth, the Buddha laid out a series of instructions for his disciples to follow, a way of leading the mind to enlightenment called the Noble Eightfold Path, the cultivation of moral discipline, mindfulness, and wisdom.
They are, as I like to think of them, a set of possible recipes that you can try on your own life and see which one makes the best soup.
The Buddha didn't speak for long, but when he was finished, the 5 skeptical ascetics had been won over. They became his first disciples. Word quickly spread of the sage teaching in the deer park at Sarnath. Hundreds came to hear him and became disciples too. Many were wealthy merchants or their sons, living just 5 miles away in a thriving trading center on the Ganges, the holy city of Benares. In time, a devoted gathering of monks formed around the Buddha at Sarnath, near the Ganges. Broken stones and fallen pillars mark what remains of what grew to be a vibrant monastic community, the Sangha.
It took the Buddha many, many years to find his way, but he didn't want it to be so hard for people. And so he established a community who could live together and help one another.
The first Sangha was a radical institution, open to people of every caste and remarkable for the times in which the Buddha lived, to both men and women. By ordaining women as nuns, the Buddha gave women the chance to escape the drudgery of daily life. The Buddha showed his followers how to come to terms with their own roiling thoughts and desires by paying attention to them, by becoming aware, becoming mindful.
Many times our mind is not peaceful enough. So we realize that perhaps we need to understand more about mind itself and how to balance the emotions, how to balance our mind and try to cultivate more happiness.
By practicing again and again, the practitioner becomes very balanced and one reaches a state of very strong equanimity. Equanimity towards the physical and mental objects. And this is the base camp for the summit. Enlightenment.
The mind is as restless as a monkey, the Buddha taught. Who you are, what you think of as yourself, is constantly changing. Like a river, endlessly flowing, one thing today, another tomorrow.
There's water in a river, then there's water in a glass, and then the water is back in the air, and then it's back in the river. The water's there, but what is it? That's a way to think about the self in Buddhism. One moment you're angry, the next moment you're laughing. Who are you? The self comes and the self goes. Simply notice how from one moment to another, yourself is actually not as much the same as we think it is. Once you stop centering your feelings about your feelings on yourself, what naturally arises is simple compassion.
Even the most abstract of the Buddha's teachings had a practical, ethical dimension. Compassion, the Buddha taught, comes from understanding impermanence, transience, flow, how one thing passes into another, how everything and everyone is connected.
This is always connected to that. Everything is connected to everything else. You never live by yourself. You live always within a family, a society, a culture. You constantly interact with other people all the time. So our happiness depends on their happiness as well. How can we be happy if we are the only one happy in just an island of happiness within an ocean of misery? Of course, that's not possible.
Compassion stirred the Buddha to send his monks out into the community. Sworn to chastity and poverty, they wandered the roads, bringing the Buddha's teachings into the world. The Buddha himself wandered across northeast India, teaching and gathering new disciples everywhere he went. You didn't have to become a monk or a nun to become a Buddhist. The Buddha's teachings were for everyone. The Buddha was, above all, a pragmatist. He did not expect his followers to agree with everything he said. He encouraged them to debate and argue, to challenge him.
Buddhists say, my follower should not accept my teaching out of devotion, but rather your own experiment. Even Buddha himself, in order to get final enlightenment, need hard work. So investigate based on reason, through logical investigation. If something contradicts in the Buddha's own word, then we have the right to reject that. We spend all our energy and time for research on matter, not internal world. This skull, small space, but a lot of mysterious things still there.
Everyday life around us is already so implausible and so glorious that what need for further miracles? And that's the teaching of the Buddha. That's the miraculous teaching of the Buddha.
Change, the Buddha said, must come from within.
The Buddha starts always with the mind and talks about the violence in the mind and says that violence in the world is a result of violence in the mind.
For decades, the Buddha shared his teachings all across northeastern India. Let all beings be happy, he taught, weak or strong, great or small. Let us cherish all creatures as a mother her only child. Barefoot in his robes, he was still walking the roads when he was 80, but old age was upon him. His back hurt, his stomach was often in pain. I am old, worn out, he told the trusted disciple, like a dilapidated cart held together with thin straps. The world is so sweet, he said, that he could understand wanting to live for at least another century. But he was frail and exhausted. He became ill near Kushinagara, a remote village near the border of Nepal, when he was offered a meal which would prove deadly. The food was spoiled. Today, Kushinagara is revered by pilgrims as the place where the Buddha finally left the world. It was in Kushinagara where he grew weak and asked to be laid on his side in a quiet grove of sal trees. As he neared the end, his disciples began to weep, stricken with grief. But the Buddha reassured them. All things change, he said. Whatever is born is subject to decay.
It's all right to feel what human beings feel. And we are not supposed to turn into rocks or trees when we practice Buddhism. Buddhas laugh, cry, dance, feel ecstasy, probably even feel despair. It is how we know the world. It is how we live inside of our hearts and not dissociated from them.
It may be that after I'm gone, the Buddha told his disciples, that some of you will think, now we have no teacher. But that is not how you should see it. Let the Dharma and the discipline that I have taught you be your teacher. All individual things pass away. Strive on, untiringly. These were the Buddha's last words. Although the Buddha had predicted that his teachings, like everything else, would in time disappear, Buddhism flourished in India for 1,500 years. Spread into Sri Lanka, Central and Southeast Asia, Tibet, China, Korea, Japan, and in the 20th century to Europe and the Americas, adapting different forms and shapes wherever it took root, attracting many millions of men and women who practiced the Buddha's teachings both within and outside the monastic community.
Every sentient being, even insect, have Buddha nature, the seed of Buddha. That's the seed of enlightenment. So therefore, there is no reason to believe some sentient being cannot become Buddha. So like that.
Remember me, the Buddha said, as the one who woke up.